Yeah, so this week is, I'm not really sure where I'm going just yet. I read it through it last night. I'm coming back in. Here's what I've been trying to think through at least a little bit.
Do you want us to record this part?
Well, yeah, it's fine. We can record it. I mean, it doesn't matter. I'm just looking at the sense of the, sorry, the crucifixion of Jesus was very much a part of his plan. And that's kind of what I'm seeing through a lot of this. Like the betrayal, all the stuff, because the leaders didn't want to crucify him around the Passover, and yet Jesus is sitting here and he's kind of like, yeah, it's going to happen soon.
Yeah.
You know, and there's the affection towards the disciples, even with Judas's betrayal. Mm-hmm. And so in many ways, I'm not really sure like how crazy I want to, like, we just came off of a communion service, so it's like, okay, I'm not necessarily going to lean a ton into that, but what are those things about making those connections to like the plan of Jesus? Mm-hmm. You know, so coming out of Matthew 24 and 25, Jesus is very clearly talking about like, okay, I'm going to die. Here's all this stuff that's going to happen.
Yeah. And
then we get those little glimpses into like just that resolution, and yet also the humanity pictured in these things of that. So that's kind of, after reading through it last night, that's what I'm chewing on. That's what I'm trying to think through. I don't know that it's really formulated that that's absolutely where I'm going yet, but that's the stuff that I'm trying to sort out in my head.
Well, I think one of the and guys, welcome back to Rough Cut Faith.
Hey,
hey,
let's do it.
Yes. So one of the things that I think you're touching on there that I certainly didn't realize was nearly as prevalent as it is when I stepped into teaching Matthew.
Yeah.
Is this idea that a lot of people look at Jesus as plan B.
Mm-hmm.
Like God created humanity. Humanity decided to separate its will from God's will, and thus God reacted and acted out of a place of reaction systematically.
Yeah.
Because if you're going to say that about Jesus, that's a thesis statement that then you have to hold to the entirety of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And that saying that, like articulating that, is not. I think I more often than not have found with folks that it's instinctual to say, no, that's not what I mean. Mm-hmm. Oh no, that's not what I think. Mm-hmm. But when actually like individualized and brought into like this component of the story, well, no, that's exactly what's the way that it's being framed. And when you look at the section of Matthew that you're heading into, you're wrapping up a huge piece of the Jewish narrative. You are starting a new chapter for Christians. There's so many things that are happening that are so many years in the making that this whole section is chocked full of pieces that you can grab onto, from the Last Supper to the language that he uses to how he interacts and doesn't interact with his disciples and all of that. Like I would, even though it seems like this is the most streamlined section of Matthew, I would say that this is some of the densest parts of Matthew that you can find.
Yeah. I think when we were trying to figure out how do we approach teaching this one, we had that conversation of there's a lot of stuff that we could really, like, if we get into the milieu of it, like into the, I don't even know if that's the appropriate use of the word, but if we could really dig into it,
Yeah.
it's like, oh man, there's so much. We could be here for another massive chunk of time.
10 weeks.
Yeah.
We'd spend 10, 12 weeks in these 2 chapters.
Yeah, and so then it was like, okay, but what, like, is this really going to be, like, can we, like, in so many ways, can we capture the big picture of it and leave some room to come back someday down the road, you know, if we're like, hey, let's look at, if we're looking at what is the new covenant that Jesus initiates here? What is this? What is that? And so it's like, I think knowing us, we'll probably come back to something like this at some point in the future, but I think at least for me, I think we're ready to see Living Kingdom as a whole come together and not lose the big picture of it, but to really just kind of like begin that process of ramping, especially in an Easter season as we're approaching, you know, Easter for Christians, the resurrection and all of the things that our minds seem to be pulled towards. And so it felt like, let's start that preparation and shift people's minds there, you know, in more of some of the big picture piece. But
I think that, just to jump off of what you were saying about these bigger chunks, we certainly could drill down deeper into this, but it's a story, and there are big. I see the last 2 chapters or the next 2 chapters here almost like, well, I was going to say Pulp Fiction. It's not exactly. It's not a good comparison, but I can't think of another vignette. Like,
would you like me to massage your feet?
It's a story that something that's happening here, and then it jumps over here, and then it jumps over here, and we could focus on each of those individual things, but you want the whole picture. Like, why would Matthew write it like this? That's the question there.
Yeah.
Why, when Matthew drills deeply in like 24 and 25, are this same conversation. Yeah. It's even a little bit of 23.
Out,
It's this long, drawn-out conversation. You look at the Sermon on the Mount, it's 3 chapters, 5, 6, and 7 is like, here's everything that Jesus talked about.
Yeah.
So Matthew gives us these long images, these long dialogues, these messages throughout, and now he gets here, and it's like speed. It's like we're ramped up now. Like we're moving fast. He's going like, and I like when Jesus finished saying all these things. It's like he finished saying 24 and 25. He finished talking about, here's what's coming, guys. Here's the end of all things. It's like giving you this hope. This is what's going to eventually happen. And then he says, and when he finished all these things, now I'm going to be handed over to be crucified. Like, what? You just told us about the end result. You just gave us all these parables about how to be watching for you and what your return looks like and all of this stuff and how that's going to happen. And now, after that, you follow it by saying, Passover's coming, I'm going to be crucified. And then we're like off and running. Then he gets anointed. Then they go and then Judas is making these deals, these backdoor deals. And then they're at the Last Supper, and Jesus is talking to them here. So the literary movement of Matthew is like editing quickly now. Now we're moving along, and it's picture here, it's a picture here, it's this story here. We're not really sure exactly what's happening in that timeline. And so I think that if we were to drill down into it, we could do that. We could focus on each individual vignette. But I think you don't do that with books all the time. You don't take a paragraph here and there. You read the story. And I feel like Matthew is moving us into this story, and like the tension is amping up, and the rising action that's happening now. This is moving forward.
For as central as the crucifixion and resurrection is for the Christian faith, it's a very small portion of Matthew. And it's a very I like the way you describe it. I know you used to edit, do film editing, and you get to a certain spot where when you're trying to tell the story, where you pick up the pace in how you edit.
The editing changes the feel of the story.
Because you want to capture the story. You
Yeah.
want to draw people into something, and it's like here we've had all this prelude
Yeah.
to this point where Jesus has talked about what it looks like to live as the people of God, and he's pushing back on so many different things and revealing what. And then all of a sudden you get to the end and it's like, zoop, and it's like, okay, now go do this.
Yeah.
You know, and so I like that. And I think that's why I know in some of our earlier conversations why we felt like let's follow Matthew.
keep the
Let's let
tone.
Matthew set the pace for this one
Yeah,
on this. So go ahead, Joe. You were starting to say something.
Well, you think that's in line with we've talked about before that the kind of the thesis statement of Matthew is outlining Christ as King, and that's very clear at the very beginning of the book with the way that the genealogies are framed and all of that, and then the way what Matthew tends to highlight in relation to what the other books tend to highlight. And for anybody who's never gone through the entirety of the crucifixion narrative and the lead up and all of that kind of stuff, you kind of have to grab from each one of the gospel accounts to get the fullest picture of the entire timeline of events. But with Matthew's in particular, I would argue that not with you guys, but I would just say like specifically, because I don't think you guys are saying anything different.
Yeah.
But it's still that same narrative of Christ as King.
Yeah.
And I would say that that's why, even if they don't get touched on and during the wrap up of Living Kingdom, like within that specific context, I would state that that's exactly why these different pieces are put, in this kind of ramping up period, what exactly is being used as those tentpole things along the way to highlight, especially when you realize the significant parts that are outlined in other gospel accounts that Matthew does not outline in this one.
Yeah. It's almost like the rejection of the king and the resurrection that affirms everything that he has taught in Matthew there's the authority for it.
Yeah.
And it's you were talking about it and I was thinking about John and some of the things that John says that paints that picture of the back and forth, between the religious leaders trying to set something up so that they've recognized that Jesus is now becoming very popular and they don't want to do anything that's going to cause them to lose that power and that influence. And we really don't see some of that dynamic nearly as much. We don't necessarily see why Judas, in any of them really, we speculate, but here we get Judas looking for opportunities to betray Jesus, like one of the inner circle. And so you start seeing the drama and all of those things at a human level build up. But you're right, Joe, the focus isn't necessarily on that, and so it's a very, I think one of the challenging parts about coming into this week and how to teach it is it's familiar, and so how do you present something that's familiar that allows people listening to go to enter into it, to allow it to be something that isn't just let me pull on heartstrings, or let me gank something out of thin air and say this is what, but instead to go okay, this is a time where we together are entering into a familiar story and finding depth and meaning and purpose and the ability to come out with a deeper sense of appreciation for Christ and for God and for what was accomplished for us. And as you said, it's not plan B.
Right.
It's not like all of a sudden Jesus is going like, well, I've been teaching this all along and nobody's really listening, so now I'm going to be crucified. And so that is, and I've had several conversations even recently with people that are, convinced that, Jesus dying was an accident. And so you have conversations with folks and it's like, wait, no, Matthew tells us this was not an accident.
Right.
This was Jesus predetermined to say, I'm going to open the door to the kingdom. I'm like, it's
Here's
here, and this is what I'm doing,
Yeah.
and this is why what I've said matters. And so we get to see that over the next 4 weeks. And
I think when you, with these bigger chunks, it's like what you zoom in on is going to determine how, where the familiarity is. So, like I always love this section with Jesus being anointed at Bethany, like, and he's there in a home of someone who used to be a leper.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh,
Yeah.
you know, in reading through this again, it just struck me like, oh, this was somebody that Jesus healed. You didn't lose leprosy. You didn't
Yeah.
like heal from leprosy. It was, you just died eventually.
Yeah.
So when Matthew says specifically, he was in the home of Simon,
Yeah.
who used to be a leper, it's
Yeah.
like, whoa,
Yeah.
like Jesus was eating a meal with
Yeah.
a guy that he healed.
Yeah.
And he was wealthy enough to bring him into his home and serve him like he and all of his followers.
Yeah.
I've never seen that before.
Yeah.
I've never really noticed, took
Yeah.
note of that. And the fact that then the woman walks in to that home and anoints him with an expensive jar of perfume, and Jesus is like, yeah, this is for my burial. Like, and also
Yeah.
she's been healed, like she's been forgiven much. So like
Yeah.
there's just so much in that vignette there. But if you haven't zoomed in on that before, taking a look at that very intimate, beautiful picture
Yeah.
of this meal with these people who have been touched by Jesus. So it's not, this is like not Jesus going out and doing miracles at this moment. This is Jesus, this is people responding to what he's already done for them
Yeah.
in this moment. It's a different feel.
Yeah.
And how we zoom in, what we zoom in on is
Yeah.
going to like create that unfamiliarity.
Yeah.
I think one of the hardest things is trying to relate the death, burial, and resurrection in light of being a part of a bigger picture, because I think that's one of the most familiar aspects of it is to be this its own standalone conversation that just kind of gets plucked out of where it's nestled into, kind of like Jesus operating in general. We see at the end of Matthew, like you were saying, there's this is the area in which he was. These are lives that he touched.
Yeah.
This is ground that he had already walked on and now is returning to, and all of those kinds of things. And I think sometimes we can fall into the trap of thinking like every single thing that Jesus did was brand new, like brand new area, brand new action, brand new everything. The people that he spoke to were the first time, because we get narratively most of the time snapshots
Yeah.
into dialogue and stuff like that. So we think about, okay, this is one separate dialogue
Yeah.
that's disconnected from this one, disconnected from this one. And then on a lot of levels,
Yeah.
you begin to realize how fundamentally grounded and rooted the end of Matthew is in the rest of the gospel account, but also at a larger scale, like you were talking about, within the realm of
Yeah.
the Old Testament, and calling back to prophecy and tradition and all of those kinds of things. So where's that line, right? Because like I can sit here and I can look at it from my biased perspective
Yeah.
and be like, oh, okay, so just chunk out like 2.5 hours,
Yeah.
tell people to pack a lunch and get into it, like, you know, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But how do you figure out where to emphasize
Sure.
in times where you could emphasize a lot of different things?
I think so, in one sense, because we've spent so long in Matthew, and we've been in a break for 2.5, close to 3 months now, you know. So it's kind of like, how do you call back and be like, hey, this is where we've been, and now we're coming to, in many ways, the climax of what's going on. And I think you can make some of those references to the big picture of what Jesus is doing, and you're leaning on, in some ways, for me, I feel like I'm leaning on having done a decent enough job helping people to understand the big picture before you get to today, in order to make the point. Because I don't think in an hour or in 30 minutes, well, I've never taught for an hour, I don't think yet. But I mean, there's always Sunday.
Challenge
So
accepted.
challenge, new challenge unlocked, right? But it's the like, okay, you present this, but then how do we respond to it? And as we were talking, I was just like, there's three responses to Jesus. You've got the first two people that respond in adoration and worship. You've got the religious leaders that have rejected, and you've got Judas that's using Jesus for his own gain. And that's a human story.
Yeah.
That's still how people tend to respond to Jesus.
Yeah.
They either just outright reject him and see him as a threat to their way of life and the way that they go about things. You've got people that have been deeply changed by Jesus and are super grateful for it, and they respond in worship and adoration. And then you've got other folks that are like, yeah, I look like I'm playing the game, and I'm just really in it for what I can get out of it. And that's a really contemplative place to be coming into this season of Easter.
Yeah.
And it's also, I think it's how when I look at this passage, I go, wow. And yet Jesus still was on a path that he had chosen to go. And so it really, in many ways, doesn't matter how people respond to Jesus. The plan of God has been the plan of God.
Yeah.
And the intention of God is the intention of God. And so it is our response, our responsibility to respond. And Matthew doesn't necessarily like focus on that, but to me, as we think through the chapter, that's really how it comes down.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think it's how he chooses these stories, right? Like this is the last week of Jesus' life. There's a lot of things that have happened.
Yeah.
And Matthew, you think of this as a documentary filmmaker, you're like, I've got 75,000 hours of footage, and I'm cutting it down to a 2-hour story or a 5-episode story.
Yeah.
I'm choosing what moves the story along.
Yeah.
I'm editing it that way.
Yeah.
So Matthew comes down to, there's 5 days here.
Yeah.
Or however long it was. There's several days here. Jesus is starting off saying Passover's coming.
Yeah.
I could have chosen then several stories to put in there, many interactions with people as he made his way into this process, into where he's going. He chose these.
Yeah.
And I think that your observation of the different responses, not to say that was Matthew's intent necessarily, but when you tell a story, you tell a story through reactions.
Yeah.
So this is like looking, as somebody is revealing in a film the deep secret, you're not looking at that person talking, you're looking at the reactions of the crowd or of the person sitting across the table.
Yeah.
This is like looking at the reactions of the people to who Jesus is, what he's claimed to be, and now he's moving into this is what's going to happen.
Yeah. And I think that's like a big picture piece, but in each of those little snapshots, I think what you talked about at the beginning, Joe, of there's so much in each of those. The preparation of Jesus' body for death, in the rejection of the religious leaders that should have, that would have looked at Scripture, would have understood the Old Testament prophecies, and yet, I mean, to be fair, like when they were reading it, they didn't make the connections, and it's, I don't, in some ways, I don't blame them. Like, I'm not like, but I'm also looking at it and going, this was the response. What Jesus was saying didn't line up with their expectations of what the Messiah figure would look like. And then you've got a guy that heard it all, that saw all the miracles, and was like, well, I'm either gonna, speculation, I'm either gonna force Jesus's hand to do what I think he's supposed to do, or I just want out. Who knows, really? Like, really, who knows? But he still betrayed him. Again,
Yep.
a fulfillment of what is attributed to Old Testament prophecy in some ways. And so you can look at those things and go, there's the human response that I think we can all still fit into, but there's also the bigger picture that you were talking about of, yeah, this is like, oh, looking back, it's like hyperlinks, you know?
Well, and I think to your point, those reactions are part of the humanity of it, is part of the bigger picture. I'm not sure how often the Bible really ever does mean to specifically highlight the humanity of it all. Sometimes, yes, but sometimes I think that's just part of it.
It's part of the story.
Just showcasing the humanity piece, and then you realize how there's nothing new under the sun.
Yeah.
Humans still react in the way that humans have always reacted, and that's literally the point of grace and mercy and love and all of those kinds of things. So when you're looking at something like this story, it's that very same notion as to what should lead you away from doing things like, and unfortunately it's taught this way a lot, that the villains of the story are the Pharisees. The villains of the story are the Jews. The villains of the story or the villain is Judas. And that reading Jesus as the conquering hero coming over adversity and all of those kinds of things. When in all actuality, we can point to people who spend an incredible amount of time in the text, but actually miss the Jesus of it all. People who hear the entirety of the message and are steeped in experience and tradition and all of those kinds of things, and still end up not believing or walking away from Jesus or something along those lines. These are things that, no, Jesus is not here flesh and blood right here and now. But I think part of the power of seeing that duality of the humanity and that humanity plugged into the bigger picture but part of that power is understanding that the continuity is there. It's not robbed of it just because we have this big climactic moment. And I think that's the entirety of looking at it from a perspective through the lens of Matthew. You get this distilled down picture that's painted from beginning to end of why we should view Christ as king.
That's good stuff.
Yeah.
So, I think if I think through like the framing in which you've got to walk people through these events and how easy it would be to get to focus in on any one specific thing. But I think you guys get the benefit of being able to lean on not just Living Kingdom, but and some of this is me speaking predated to when I joined, but I would imagine that this holds true even before Living Kingdom, that you guys have already painted the picture that there's a much larger story at play, and kind of the most impactful notes of something like this that you can see just past, I don't know, the kid story of it all with the death, burial, and resurrection. And I don't mean to diminish it. I really don't.
No,
but
it is it's a very singularly focused,
yeah,
I'll help the kids understand a big picture point. And it's just,
Right here.
yeah.
No diminish taken.
I think it's hard to say the cross isn't that big, because it is. Like, it is the central point of our faith. If even if, like Paul's saying, if Christ wasn't crucified and then raised again, then none of this matters. Like, everything we've done doesn't matter. But I do go back to Jesus saying, I'm the gate. Like I'm the way, and there's a path of life. I'm the gate. So he is the entry point into a path of life.
Yeah.
He is the entry point into a kingdom living,
Yeah.
A way of life. So to not diminish the centrality of the cross, and yet to say, but that's the beginning point. Like that's the doorway.
Yeah.
Let's not spend all of our time just talking about how great the doorway was. Let's walk the path.
Yeah.
Let's move into the kingdom then. Let's spend and I feel like in Matthew, we've taken so much of that time, and Jesus spent so much time, everything just talking about the kingdom. And then it's like, okay, at the end, here's the doorway in.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, go out and live the
Yeah,
kingdom.
go out and do
Yeah.
this.
So
It's almost like the prelude is, and I don't know if this is the right way to say it. It's almost like the prelude is the epilogue. And the chapters is what happens in and around the
Yeah.
crucifixion, resurrection.
yeah.
Yeah.
You know, it's like and the epilogue is short in one sense because the prelude was so detailed.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and I think as you've described it, you know, from when we started back in Life Sketches and tried to start looking at the scope of
big
the story of
picture, yeah.
people in throughout, you know,
Yeah.
leading up to Christ, and then the minor notes, looking through the minor prophets and seeing all these things, and then Clash of Kingdoms and looking at what Jesus taught on the Sermon on the Mount, and then back into Living
Yeah.
Kingdom. It's like there's been a consistency of going, this is the story that we find ourselves in, and now how do we respond to it?
Yeah.
How do we live in light of it? And that's the spot that I feel like in some ways, you know, you have to root people in a bigger story in order for our faith to be meaningful.
Yeah.
In order for us to go, it's worth it to like count the cost to follow Jesus.
Yeah.
And that's I think the thing that I keep coming back to, especially as you come to these familiar passages. It's so
Yeah.
easy to just glaze over it.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's easy for me to just glaze over it because I'm like, oh, I couldn't guess how many times I've read these things.
Yeah.
You know, and so it's easy to just like, and so it's like, whoa, hold on, slow down, enter into this, like look back at this, consider what's going on, and force myself to not just go to something.
We want to move to the cross too quickly.
Yeah.
I think, and that's also the not the frustration, just the challenge of going, oh, we've got these 4 weeks, and I look at these passages and like I'd love to take 10 weeks, 8 weeks maybe, and move through these because we want to get to the cross so quickly, and I think that as in evangelical world, we tend to make that happen. Getting back to what you like, how do you get beyond the kid's story, like that focus? I draw the comparison to like marriage, the wedding day is a celebration. It's worth celebrating. But like today's my 24th anniversary, and we celebrate the anniversary. But if we're just always celebrating the anniversary, we miss 24 years of life.
Yep.
And so that wedding was important for my life.
Yeah.
But everything that's happened after that is what's more important than the wedding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so crucifixion and Christ's death and resurrection, that's important. We wouldn't be here without it. But everything else that happens in life, how we respond to that, how we respond to Jesus every single day, that's
the outflow.
That's
of
the
it.
outflow of
Yeah.
it. And that's what we have to like always come back to.
Yeah.
That's what we have to keep in front of us all
Yeah.
the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. That I'm finding that to be a fascinating experiment when trying to utilize those very same concepts that you guys are talking about and use that as a springboard working into Acts and looking at what does the world look like after Jesus came back.
Yeah.
And what does life for his followers look like moving forward.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think if all we're focused on is death, burial, and resurrection, there's a lot that we miss. And I understand that that flies in the face of a lot of traditions. I get that. This is my shocked face that I'm the one who said something that flies in the face of a lot of tradition. But without diminishing it, like you said, there's this feeling like it's just setting the stage. Like the ending of Matthew is this scene that almost feels anticlimactic in nature because it's setting up for now life happens.
Yeah.
Like this happened, now life
Now go
begins.
do it.
Now go live this.
Yeah.
And that's powerful and is something that, like we carry those things with us, those truths with us, but we still have to reconcile how to live these things out and how to operate in a way where being like Christ is not just a list of virtuous things. It's not just a list of activities. It's a way of being. And that's why I go back to I'm one of those Christians. To use a $5 word, I am not wholly unconvinced that, or I remain open to the fact that I think theosis is possible.
So I think as we get into this spot of Matthew 26, and we have the institution of the new covenant between Jesus, between God and man. It's like all of a sudden you've got a new covenant. You've got the sacrifice that validates the covenant. The sacrifice is made. And then there's the resurrection for the affirmation that these promises that Christ has made, that he would be with his disciples to the ends of the earth, right? All that his authority is there to tell them, you can go and do these things.
Yeah.
It's almost like you get to the end and here's the promises that God's making to us. Here's the proof that God will keep his word. Here's the commissioning to go and live it out. And so you get 25 chapters of what it looks like to live it out.
Yeah.
And so that informs as you're going into Acts. I think you just get to see how the church was trying to live it out, how the church was, how did the expansion of this go? And then you start plugging in some of the epistles and getting little, oh, look, it's another vignette into a church in a different part of the world. And how are they trying to do what Jesus told the disciples to do? And it's like, that's the stuff that gets me excited. Like now, not maybe not as much, earlier, because it was this weird world of like, I had this very homogenous view of every church was just like this. They had all the same problems. They had all the same this, that, and the others. And it's like, and yet coming back through Matthew, going through the context of what God had been calling his people to live like, there's a response. There's a response to the promises that Jesus has made. There's a response to actually being faithful to go and do what he's called us to do, to obey what he's called us to do, to love him well in how we live. And then, like, I think about what we're talking about today, much like, or this week and today, it's, people were already responding to Jesus on the front side. And then we just have what enables and empowers us to go out, seen in a little snippet. And it's like, it's almost just like, all right, I've told you what to do. Go play, to use your word, Joe.
Yeah.
So, guys, thank you for joining us for another conversation as we enter back into the home stretch, at least of this iteration of looking at Matthew. Lord knows you guys will probably figure out another way to approach it here in the future. But guys, if you have any questions along the way from anything that we covered here today, go ahead and feel free to drop a comment. We appreciate the engagement, hearing the things that come up for you guys, specifically. And if you're here on Sunday and you have any questions about anything that you hear now or on Sunday, you can send all complaint letters to
Jeremy.
Yeah, to Jeremy. There you go, even better. You can go ahead and engage during the Q&R time. Then. So, thank you guys.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy.
And have a great day. Have a great day, guys.
Good, thanks. Which camera is this? I'm like looking somewhere different. This one?
Yeah. That's leave all of that in. So